Oh my God.
Today, I am joined by Keith Jackewicz. This is ArtiFact number 21, and we're going to be talking about Kurt Vonnegut's novel Galapagos. This is actually the third book that I'm doing on this channel by Kurt Vonnegut. So, first one, I believe it was Keith and I. We did Cat's Cradle. Then I did Breakfast of Champions with Joel. Now we're doing Galapagos here. I feel like I keep like dancing around the elephant in the room, which is Slaughterhouse-Five, right? That is his best book. I feel like a show on that would probably go the longest, simply because there's so much to discuss. But thankfully, there's also a lot to discuss in Galapagos, right? It's an interesting text. It's pretty underrated because I just sort of assumed that Vonnegut kind of fell off in the late 70s or 80s and just didn't really produce much of value after that. But Galapagos is on par, at least with some of the kind of early classics, if you want to call them classics, like Mother Night. Maybe not as good as his best books, but still pretty worthwhile. So this is what we're going to be doing here. I'm not sure, Keith, if you want to like introduce the text or do some kind of synopsis. I mean, there's a few different ways that we could tackle it, right? I mean, one of the interesting things about this book is it's even more kind of convoluted in terms of plot than something like Cat's Cradle, right? Even though Cat's Cradle also has any number of like convolutions and but like Galapagos it's really kind of disjointed, right? In the sense that things are being communicated right as they are, meaning like humanity a million years after the fact, this is what they look like, in this kind of post-evolutionary phase. Maybe they sort of like stop developing at a certain point and things are just kind of prehistoric again. We don't totally get a sense of that, but it tends to kind of go like back and forth very slowly. These like details of the plot get revealed to you, so little things that maybe don't make sense, like a stray statement or a stray comment from Vonnegut, they do kind of like open up as the book goes on. And I do think, even more so than maybe some of his other books, it's definitely a book that does get better as the book goes on, right? You could like open up Slaughterhouse-Five, and pretty much from the first, either the preface or even like the first proper chapter, let's call it, you could tell like right away from the first line, first paragraph, that it's going to be probably a very good book, right? Because the writing is just so kind of it's poetic, it's interesting. Here a lot of it is a lot more prosaic. There's a lot more description, right? There's a lot less dialogue in this novel compared to frankly maybe most of his books, right? So a lot more kind of physical description. And you could call the ghost character, right, Leon Trotsky Trout.
Leon Trout.
Yeah, Leon, it's Leon Trotsky Trout, right? The full name.
Is Trotsky the original last name of the Trout family? I can't remember.
No, I think that's just his middle name of the book, Leon Trotsky Trout.
Oh, I don't.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's Leon Trotsky Trout, which is like, I'm not exactly sure if that's supposed to be like a comment of some sort, or an anti-symbol of some sort, in the sense of like it seems to want to be a symbol, but it's just kind of like a red herring, right? Where you keep going down the wrong track. But anyway, I feel like I talked enough here. Maybe you could say a few words by way of introduction about the text.
Well, this text is Kurt Vonnegut's most enduring and interesting contribution to decolonization theory, positing that we will evolve into a species more closely resembling seals than humans, and be mostly descended from the last remnants of a genocided indigenous tribe in South America. It's an interesting choice, but no, it feels a lot like a last book to me, actually. It's kind of interesting that he had two more proper novels and one novel memoir hybrid after this, and a bunch of short story collections, because I mean, you can't psychologize someone from a book, but it certainly it not only suggests like a certain frustration with humanity itself on Vonnegut's part, like almost a terminal frustration, but it's also, in terms of possible endings to Kurt Vonnegut's like shared universe that a lot of his books, like God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, and Slaughterhouse-Five, and this book, and Breakfast of Champions, and then Bluebeard after this, which I don't think he should have done anything else in this universe after this. It's sort of, in this world of, kind of pitiable and often stupid, but simple and also often sweet people. The idea that it will all just sort of end in chaos and end in humanity basically reverting to a state matching its actual simplicity that the neuroses and boredom of people inflate to, world-destroying proportions. It does feel like a very poetic and appropriate ending to, I guess, Kurt Vonnegut's literary stamp on the world. It seems kind of a shame to me that there were other books after this. But to just describe the book a little bit, it is the story. It's kind of similar to you ever seen the movie Red before?
The
Kieslowski movie?
1980s movie.
Yeah, the movie by Kieslowski that was the last movie in the blue, white, red trilogy. Yeah. So I remember when our mutual friend Dan Schneider reviewed that movie, he said it's a little pat that all these interesting people were on this boat that sank at the end of the movie, but you can maybe you can sort of justify it as like, that's kind of the reason that this crash would be interesting at all, is if these people were themselves interesting. And so this is a little bit of the same thing, where it is essentially the story of a shipwreck, not a shipwreck, a ship breakdown of a group of people in the Galapagos Islands in the year 1986, that happens as a result of a global economic crisis that leads to food riots in the country of Ecuador, where most of the diegetic present, I guess none of it is present day technically, but where most of the action takes place, and they flee from it in a boat that has been stripped clean of all of its equipment and all of its rations. And so these people end up on this island, and they end up stranded there the rest of their lives, because the rest of society ends up breaking down as a result of he says bacteria. It really probably should be virus, because bacteria are pretty killable actually, as a result of this microorganism that develops that ends up destroying the fertility of every woman on the planet. So civilization everywhere but on this island collapses. And so these people end up being the last human beings and building a little society. And the society, because of the relative lack of sophisticated resources that are available to these people and the specific survival needs, over the course of a million years, ends up with these humans evolving into I guess simpler organisms, more similar to like chimpanzees, but with the qualities of like seals or walruses, with like leathery skin and fur. And the whole thing is told from the perspective of Leon Trout, who is the son of Kurt Vonnegut's erstwhile sci-fi writer, sort of self-insert but sort of not character, Kilgore Trout, who most people will know from Breakfast of Champions, but who's also mentioned in God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, and Slaughterhouse-Five as well, and maybe some other books as well.
Some other books too.
Yeah. who has, as a result of his eminent curiosity about his fellow human beings, declined an invitation to go to the afterlife, and so is trapped on the planet for 1 million years to watch this evolution happen in real time. So it's kind of a hard book to give a synopsis of. Like, you could write something on a dust jacket that is suggestive, but
yeah,
you're right when you say it's one of the most tangential books that he's ever written, in that it sort of goes off in every direction and follows almost every character to at least a mild degree. But I guess you could say it's the life stories and circumstances of the people that ended up on this boat that came to this island, and the sort of improbable series of circumstances that would have had to happen for any humans to survive this fertility destroying microorganism.
Yeah. You want to continue?
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of summarizing the text, I mean, what makes it difficult is you see like little like slivers of a character, right? You see like a little bit of who this person is, and just more details are filled in kind of like as we go, right? And he intentionally seems to leave. Well, I can't say intentionally, but it does seem intentional to me. Like certain details aren't fully kind of fleshed out, and certain things are missing, right? Like in terms of if you want to correct me if I'm wrong, but nothing is explicitly stated about the level of complexity, right, in this like new society of these like aquatic sort of human beings, right? We know that perhaps they are like less intelligent, maybe. We know for a fact that they're like less willing to be like they're not liars in the way that human beings are liars, right? That's the sort of the implication, right? In terms of like Kurt Vonnegut's idea about like the big brain, right? The big brain is what's causing all these problems for humanity, and now we have simpler creatures with like smaller brains. We don't know whether there's like some sort of like enduring civilization, or whether these are just kind of animals that are doing kind of like more typical animal things. And we also don't get any specifics about like, we know there's like some sort of global financial crisis, but we don't know what it is. We don't know what causes it. We don't know the reason behind it, which I think actually is a pretty good idea, right? We know that these things will always kind of balloon, and they will always explode or implode, as it were. And we don't really need to know exactly what the specifics are. We just need to know that there's most likely a human brain that's involved and makes it happen in the way that it happens, right? So the fact that these kinds of details aren't truly revealed, I think it really sheds light, and it kind of is mutually reinforcing of some of the kind of deeper thematic questions in the text, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, Kurt Vonnegut himself was, I don't think he was ever a professional anthropologist, but he has training in the field of anthropology.
Yeah.
And so a lot of his books, they have the quality of like a ghost or an alien engaging in like anthropological description of human beings and their ways and their doings. And he gets to that in this book by this, million-year-old ghost character. But there is a passage at some point in the book, very nice little summation, where he said, well, suddenly everybody, these creatures with their big brains, they just needed to have opinions about things, even things that they probably didn't need to have opinions about. And just sometimes they just all changed their opinions about what certain things were worth, and what they were going to do economically with one another.
And those are the terms in which that he describes the financial crisis, which I thought was like a very nice technique, right? At some point, he basically says, so I mean, I guess it's jumping up a little bit. I want to start with chapter 1, but like just to stay with this in chapter 5. So when he's discussing the financial crisis, he's basically making these allusions to the big brain and the fact that human beings, because they're so kind of fickle, right, in their opinions, they just decided one day that paper money wasn't worth anything, right? Um, and it was something like this. So like Mexico and Chile and Brazil and Argentina were likewise bankrupt. In Indonesia, and the Philippines and Pakistan and India and Thailand and Italy and Ireland and Belgium and Turkey. Whole nations were suddenly in the same situation as the San Mateo, unable to buy with their paper money and coins or their written promises to pay later, even the barest essentials. Persons with anything life-sustaining to sell, fellow citizens as well as foreigners, were refusing to exchange their goods for money. They were suddenly saying to people with nothing but paper representations of wealth, "Wake up, you idiots. Whatever made you think that paper was so valuable?" Right. Like and the thing that makes this technique so good from, like a purely kind of like artistic standpoint, is in the fact that, again, he's being non-specific about the reasons for the crisis, but it doesn't really matter because, every single time, it's, even if like the specifics are different, the underlying cause, right, human intervention, that sort of remains. And there is something to be said for this idea of like, an opinion suddenly arising that paper money is no longer good, right? Because, I mean, if you think of like fiat currency, the fiat comes from a government promise, right? A government being able to tax its citizenry, is, able to have a productive workforce of some kind, able to have like an educated population, all those things, right? If you think of like debt, right? Debt, has a long history of being used as money, right? It's not just like modern, complex, like cut up securities, right? Or like collateralized debt that you could buy or whatever. It's not, it doesn't even have to be like complex financial instruments, right? Debt has been used as money. People have been operating under this assumption for, at minimum, many, many centuries, if not longer, right? Likely to go back even like to ancient Greece. You're going to find some examples of this, but this is something that people are operating under. And something occurs, right, where they no longer, accept that a country can fulfill its promises, when like oftentimes that's kind of like, that often is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If a bunch of people do decide that this country is no longer good, is no longer able to, function, like that's always strikes me as a kind of collective decision that a world always makes. It's not necessarily reflective of reality. Like when Europe basically, essentially ganged up on Greece, right, during the 2008 crisis, right? They started like blaming Greece for, like living beyond its means and stuff like that. And, everybody gets together, they start applying, well, specifically Germany, right? Start applying these like strict sort of austerity measures, and things do sort of take on this quality. And we don't know if this is exactly what's happening here, but I mean, the possibilities are open. And you do get the sense as the book goes on that a lot of this behavior is very self-fulfilling, right? These are self-fulfilling prophecies, and this is what people are doing, right? Human beings are responsible for this. This isn't just some sort of random thing that happens, in nature, right? This is what we do. And also just this kind of like running away from responsibility, right? This idea that nobody ever really wants to admit, right, to what extent their interventions are creating these issues.
Well, yeah, also, and I mean, we know that Kurt Vonnegut was some kind of a leftist. I don't think he would have called himself like a Marxist or anything like that.
I think he did call himself a socialist or something. He might have.
Yeah, I my guess is that he probably would have identified more with like the sort of anarchistic sphere of socialism. And especially that's a trend that I find in a lot of anthropologists, because that's just kind of what they see in the historical record as a way that people have lived that has worked in the past. This is a bit more of a stretch, and I don't know if this would have been conscious on his part, but there is like an implicit critique there also of the switch to like marginalism as like the primary understanding of like value and like transfer of goods and services. Because I mean, at the beginnings of capitalism's development as an economic system, even Adam Smith would have agreed with Karl Marx that labor was the thing that creates value. And it's not necessarily wrong to bring like marginal utility into the picture, but when it becomes the only when it becomes like really the focal point of your entire analysis, you are taking it away from like collective human considerations, and you are putting it in the hands of something much more fickle, which is an opinion that is informed by metrics and algorithms that may or may not have anything to do with actual like flesh and blood, living, breathing human beings that are right in front of you. So it's, I mean, you maybe can't say that it's I mean, you know, every leftist is very boring when they try to make everything about how capitalism is bad. But I mean, there is, you can certainly bring that angle into it, especially knowing that probably Kurt Vonnegut would have been at least somewhat sympathetic to an argument like that, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but you said you wanted to start with chapter 1.
Yeah, I mean, I just always like to give people like a sense of what an introduction feels like, and you know, also like just this idea that I mean, you need to have good beginnings, you need to have good endings, right? And it does sort of set the tone. And so like also like the book is set up into like I think altogether it's something like 50 or so chapters, but it is 2 parts. The first one is book 1, The Thing Was, and the second one is, I think it's The Thing Became. No, and The Thing Became is the second part, right? So and he sort of like uses that as the beginning line, right, for both of the books. So The Thing Was begins with the line, "The thing was, 1 million years ago, back in 1986 AD, Guayaquil was the chief seaport of the little South American democracy of Ecuador, whose capital was Quito, high in the Andes Mountains. Guayaquil was 2 degrees south of the equator, the imaginary belly band of the planet after which the country itself was named. It was always very hot there, and humid too, for the city was built in the doldrums, in a springy marsh through which the mingled waters of several rivers draining the mountains flowed. This seaport was several kilometers from the open sea. Rafts of vegetable matter often clogged the soupy waters, engulfing pilings and anchor lines." And I mean, even here, right? So this is like a level of description that is usually not present in Kurt Vonnegut. And you're getting like little, like he's throwing out little things that sort of take on more and more significance, right, as the book goes on, right? This like rafts of vegetable matter are often clogging the soupy waters, right? This like vegetable matter later on becomes a kind of like metaphor for human beings and human existence. Also, at some point, you have like a character, Mary Hepburn, who, when the captain gets upset that she's like using a sperm, she says something like, "I could have, you know, if I could have, you know, done this through like, you know, the birds," or like I think at some point she says something like these like rafts, like we could have used that too, right? So these like little objects, right? They sort of become things that Kurt Vonnegut uses, right? And he throws them at you in ways that are unexpected. Like later on in the book, he uses Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, right, as this kind of, you know, like black humor, right? When somebody dies, the joke is someone says, "Well, you know, it's not like he would have composed Beethoven's Ninth Symphony," right? And even in that little description of the financial crisis, he says something like, you know, and the financial crisis was as a result of the big brain as Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, right? So all of these things take on a significance that you only really get to see as the book goes on, and also you start noticing them come at you earlier on, like if you reread it, right? So the beginning is just kind of like throwing all these details out to you. So he continues, Human beings had much bigger brains back then than they do today, and so they could be beguiled by mysteries. One such mystery in 1986 was how so many creatures which could not swim great distances had reached the Galapagos Islands, an archipelago of volcanic peaks due west of Guayaquil. Separated from the mainland by 1,000 kilometers of very deep water, very cold water fresh from the Antarctic. When human beings discovered those islands, there were already geckos and iguanas and rice rats and lava lizards and spiders and ants and beetles and grasshoppers and mites and ticks in residence, not to mention enormous land tortoises. What form of transportation had they used? Many people were able to satisfy their big brains with this answer. They came on natural rafts. Other people argued that such rafts became waterlogged and rotted to pieces so quickly that nobody had ever seen one out of sight of land, and that the current between the islands and the mainland would carry any such rustic vessel northward rather than westward. Or they asserted that all those landlubberly creatures had walked dry shod across a natural bridge or had swum short distances between stepping stones, and that one such formation or another had since disappeared beneath the waves. But scientists using their big brains and cunning instruments had by 1986 made maps of the ocean floor. There wasn't a trace, they said, of an intervening landmass of any kind. Other people back in that era of big brains and fancy thinking asserted that the islands had once been part of the mainland and had been split off by some stupendous catastrophe. But the islands didn't look as though they had been split off from anything. They were clearly young volcanoes which had been vomited up right there where they were. Many of them were such newborns out there that they could be expected to blow again at any time. Back in 1986, they hadn't even sprouted much coral yet, and so were there without blue lagoons and white beaches, amenities many human beings used to regard as foretastes of an ideal afterlife. A million years later, they do possess white beaches and blue lagoons. But when this story begins, they were still ugly humps and domes and cones and spires of lava, brittle and abrasive, whose cracks and pits and bowls and valleys brimmed over not with rich topsoil or sweet water, but with the finest, driest volcanic ash. Another theory back then was that God Almighty had created all those creatures where the explorers found them, so they had no need for transportation. Another theory was that they had been shooed ashore there by two down the gangplank of Noah's Ark. If there really was a Noah's Ark, and there may have been, I might entitle my story "A Second Noah's Ark." So yeah, like all this stuff gets thrown at you right away. Again, the most kind of purely descriptive and philosophical intro of the ones that come to mind immediately from Kurt Vonnegut for me. But you know, there's also this at the end, this kind of like biblical layer, which I find. I mean, there's a few things you could say about her, right? Because you know, first of all, like you could ask yourself, like, okay, is there some sort of like moral lesson here, right? In the sense that if you think of like, you know, the biblical story of Noah's Ark and the flood, Noah is supposed to be a righteous man that God separates from everyone else, right, in terms of his righteousness, and says, I will save you and everyone else can die. So, you know, let's save the world together, right, by building this ark, and we're gonna put you and you know, all these animals into it. But of course, like when you kind of like like if you're not a Christian, right, or you're not a Jew, and you're just kind of, you know, like an everyday kind of modern person, you parse that story out, and it's not exactly clear what exactly is, you know, God's righteousness there really mean. What exactly is it coming from? What is the point? Is this not rather an example of cruelty? And I think it's just applicable here, right? Because if you want to assume there is some kind of biblical overlap, right, which the narrator here suggests, right, explicitly, I think it's much closer to, you know, a more modern interpretation of Noah's flood than anything else, because you know, there's nothing actually here that selects these people to go on this ship and being the kind of, you know, the creators of humanity, right, going forward, right. there's nothing like especially moral about them. There's nothing especially necessarily good. In fact, like at least one of the characters is a sociopath, right? We have Tom, is it Tom or is it wait, what is his first name? Oh, James Wade.
James Wade.
Yeah, James Wade. So, James Wade is a sociopath. He makes it on this like Noah's Ark. We have Mary Hepburn, who seems like a good person, right? She makes it on this ark. We have this like captain who doesn't know how to, command this ship, who's just living this kind of, it seems like a gluttonous, self-absorbed life. You have some, random tribal girls from this like Native American tribe that was slowly being killed off in Ecuador. So they make it on, right? There's no God, right? Like God becomes this kind of like element of chance essentially in this book. Nothing really commands these people to go on it, but it just so happens that way. And so much of the book is about this kind of happenstance of evolution, in the sense of like there can't truly be a de-evolution in any way, because evolution merely, just takes what is best for survival and fuck the rest, right? Everything else doesn't matter. All it is about, survival and the passing on of genetic material, right? Well, the second, object is the true object, right? The passing on genetic material. And to the extent that your survival helps that out, right, then your survival can be extended too. And, there's this like element of randomness, right? You cannot have a de-evolution because the goal never changes. The goal is always fixed. That goal is the passing on of genetic material, right? And same thing here, right? There's this random, set of events that occur essentially that really, just kind of like put humanity on this like a straight and narrow path, right, that ends up taking in this area. So, it's an interesting use of the Bible, primarily because again, as modern people, we will have a very different view of Noah's flood, right, than perhaps readers from centuries prior.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's, in some ways you can see it as like Vonnegut kind of maybe correcting the parts of the Bible that that one can be uncomfortable with, just the wanton genocide and destruction of almost all life on the planet. In this case, it's only humans that are killed, and they are killed, I mean, essentially by something that we now know after a year and a half of pandemic is at least a little bit the human's fault, because we know that most viruses or bacteria that we're going to come into contact with that are going to be novel and that are going to harm us in this way are probably going to be things that either we were fucking around in a laboratory, or we were engaging in destruction of nature and coming into contact with parts of nature that allow for zoonotic spillover to happen. So wherever this microorganism that kills, that destroys human fertility comes from, it's something that in all likelihood we had at least a decent hand in introducing into ourselves. And if you think about who actually reaches the island and not who's on the ark, you can maybe say that the selection process is not specifically righteousness, but maybe like a certain degree of blamelessness, I guess. The only person that's like an outright pretty bad person that reaches the island is the captain, is Adolf von Kleitz, but he is not really like a mover or a player in like the things that, he's kind of like the it's implied that there's like one of these German brothers that is at the head of this business that is like a big deal, that is like the most dedicated. And then there is Siegfried von Kleitz, right? I'm saying the right last name. Yeah. Who is kind of the most slackerish brother that they make go work in this hotel in Guayaquil, just so that he is contributing in some way to their financial empire. And then this guy seems to not really be involved in the business as much as he's like the schmoozer. He's the one that goes and shakes hands and goes to the parties and is kind of charming in a superficial way, but he's not the one guy, in the same way that he's not the one that was supposed to actually pilot the ship. when the cruise was happening. He's not the one that's actually piloting the company. He's just sort of like the amicable face of it. And everyone else, you know, Mary Hepburn is essentially as much a victim of this like economic downturn that's happening as anybody else, although in her case, it's a localized economic downturn that happened because of outsourcing and automation of a lot of the jobs at the local plant that caused her husband to be fired. You have these 4 children that are these starving orphans that they're reclusive jungle dwelling tribe has been, it's not implied if it's on purpose or an accident, but, you know, exterminated from the planet by these multinational corporations dropping pesticide on the jungle, presumably so they can turn it into some sort of productive arable farmland. And you have this Japanese woman who is the son of someone that Vonnegut clearly has some degree of, if not disdain for, then at least like intense skepticism. You know, this guy who was going to help, you know, create this machinery that's going to push more people out of jobs and make more exploitation of the planet possible and cause more dehumanization. And he's killed before he even gets on the boat. You have the blind girl that makes it to the island that is basically just the daughter of this sociopathic, or sorry, it says pathological, this like, you know, this pathological multi-billionaire who has, in the midst of a financial crisis, wants to buy up most of Ecuador, or at least as much of it as he can obtain, and then sell it back to the people or rent it back out to the people, essentially. And he's also murdered before he ever gets on the boat. And then there is, who is there anybody else that makes it to the island besides that?
I made a list of characters to get through.
And James Waite is, what I was gonna say is James Waite is on the boat, but he dies before they actually reach the island.
Yeah, he does have a heart attack.
In fact, the only version of him that makes it to the island is the good person that he pretends to be, that Mary Hepburn carries with her in her heart for the rest of her life for whatever reason. She was so struck by this man's seeming generosity in a moment of turmoil, and she forms a connection with his false presentation of himself that, you know, for the rest of her life she can say that she was married to 2 good men.
What was that?
Sorry, I just killed an insect. That was crawling on my leg.
What kind?
Well, a spider's not an insect, but it was a spider.
Oh,
I don't like killing spiders, but when they're on me, all bets are off. Especially when I'm recording.
Reminds me of To Kill a Morning Spider, because I don't kill spiders either.
Yeah, I don't kill them in general. My wife makes me sometimes because she hates spiders. But if I can preserve it and get it to a safe place, I will absolutely.
Do you have a bug cup?
No, I just use whatever I have available to me. Usually a piece of paper and a Tupperware container.
I put out a very interesting bug a couple days ago. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but its belly looked like a frog's belly. It was like seemed like very firm and juicy. You know what I mean? And it was big, and it had wings, but it wasn't using its wings for any reason. Made me very fearful for it.
Yeah, and since I ruined the flow here, just an apology to anybody who earlier heard my phone ring on my audio. I forgot to silence it, and I had to text my wife to let her know I was recording. So apologies for that. And I don't have a physical copy of the book. I have it on Kindle, but my Kindle, the battery is dead. So if I'm looking at my phone, I'm not being distracted from the conversation. I just have, that's where the book happens to be for me.
And if you're listening to this on audio podcast, right? We are on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, whatever you get your podcast from, we're on it. You wouldn't have that indignity, right? Of watching Keith go on his phone as we're talking, right? Because he's also trying to tune out the audience, not just me.
Yes. And apologies if my lighting is poor to anybody watching this on YouTube. I'm currently in the process of gearing up for a move to New York City in a couple of months.
So
Alex and I have talked.
we'll be
I'm going to
recording
be,
these in person.
yes, well, Alex and I have talked. I'm going to be moving into his house and sleeping in his bed with him and his wife in between the two of them.
No, he'll be sleeping on the cat couch with that cat pillow there.
Yes.
Right. It's
Yes,
it's about 5 feet, right? So Keith is about like 6'8". So his shins will be dangling off. We'll put a fucking carton box for his shins.
Oh God, I can't even imagine being 6'8". I already feel like a behemoth at 6'3".
Yeah.
I remember when the first time I visited you, Lisa and I took a picture together, and Dan said it looked like if it was just our skeletons that somebody found a million years later, they would think it was like two different like two different ape creatures, like they were different species.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's I don't know, it's good being 5'8". It's nice.
Yes.
I wouldn't want to be 6'8".
So anyway, what I was saying, I think the I don't know that Vonnegut goes in for righteousness as a virtue as much, because he sort of sees everybody as flawed and fucked up and kind of consumed by their petty neuroses and insecurities. I think what he kind of admires and perhaps wishes to put on his new Mount Ararat, the Galapagos Islands, is people who were essentially, if not decent, then at least not particularly responsible for the shabby state of the world that they leave behind. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Biblical justice that he can get more behind.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess since James Waite doesn't truly make it, onto the island, right? You have this, that is also like another little kind of, detail, right, for this like Noah's Ark metaphor, right? But yeah, still, like we essentially get, the same kind of, it's the same kind of bottleneck effect. And it also just as always, right, just like in the Bible, there's still this like feeling of there's like an arbitrary feeling to it, right? In a sense, like when it comes to evolution, more or less every bottleneck is arbitrary from your vantage, right? Because you as a human being are probably not viewing things necessarily from passing down genetic material, right? We're thinking of like higher thoughts all the time, but from our vantage, it's always going to feel kind of arbitrary, right? All the kind of choices and dead ends, right, that natural selection tends to make, right? So, and this obviously is critical for the book, right? Because the controlling metaphor, right, is the big brain, right? It is evolution, right? He said that he wanted to write this book on evolution, and part of the reason why it took him so long is he just felt like I'm not a biologist, right? Which it seems kind of odd to me. I mean, like you could always use anything as a controlling metaphor pretty much without necessarily being an expert in it, because you as a writer, like your task is to get that essential information out, make it somehow like coherent, make it poetic, make it work, in ways beyond like pure detail, right? But that was, Vonnegut's feeling there. So, all right. So I guess like, so that was a chapter 1, right? We're basically given just a set of descriptions. We're giving the philosophy. We're giving the skeleton going forward. Once chapter 2 begins, we're immediately introduced to James Waite, which again, I think is a pretty good technique, right? We have a almost kind of like purely philosophical and descriptive start that kind of sets things structurally as well. And then in the second chapter, we get James Waite, who's, I mean, he's interesting to read about, right? Like he's presented as a sociopath and liar, right? You sort of want to figure out what exactly he gets into, and you also want to see what he'll end up doing to some of these characters, right? Because the way that he's described, he's someone that could potentially, right, if you haven't read the book before, he could, create mayhem for everybody, right, which is
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of the implication that we get with his description. But the irony, of course, is that near the end of the book, he ends up doing, I guess, like some positive things, right? He ends up like allowing Mary Hepburn to kind of, marry for a second time to this guy, and sort of have him die with these fantasies of him in her own head, right? And she's able to
Mm-hmm.
sort of hold on to them. And he's also the one that's like feeding some of the native girls that are just, dying from hunger, right? So these are the actual kind of substantive interactions that he ends up having with people on the ship, right? He's not really given too much opportunity to create mayhem, partly because, I mean, at that point, with like sort of, paper money being valueless, and Mary not necessarily having much to give, there's not too much room for his kind of like brand of, like badness to percolate through this area. But
well, he
yeah,
also is the reason that they're alive to be on the ship, because the fact that he had a heart attack at the perfect moment made them stop at the hospital instead of going all the way to the airport where they probably would have been killed.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's a very Vonnegutian touch that this bad person, ultimately, and I mean, he probably doesn't. It's weird because Vonnegut would say he's a bad person, but then he would also include all of the sort of extenuating circumstances of his life that make him a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
He sort of, with most of his characters, he kind of plays on both levels simultaneously, where you can judge them interpersonally, but not without understanding, I guess, how they got to the point that they got to.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very Vonnegutian touch that, this guy who's kind of a bad person ends up, being that positive, quote unquote, force in the story, where without him being there, a worse outcome would have occurred.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he's also an interesting character because, like, he is a bad person, but you can also see that, like, nothing in his life would have prepared him to be a good person. He was the product of an incestuous relationship, which already can manifest in genetic or psychological defects in the offspring of such a pairing. And then he's put in these foster homes where he is consistently abused. There's a scene later in the book where he is embarrassed to take his shirt off in front of a woman because he's ashamed of all the scars that are all over his body from all the abuse that he suffered. And I mean, he just has never been in a position to form like normal human attachments with other people. And so his brain just isn't, his big brain, lacking all of the sort of normal ways that you would interpersonally connect with people, can only view them as like objects to have like advantage gleaned from.
Yeah. So after like James Wade is introduced, I mean, yeah, he is nicely sketched out, specifically also in that chapter. But after he gets introduced, we're now back to the kind of like, the overvoice. We're back to some of the more kind of like purely thematic content. And Vonnegut states, it is hard to believe nowadays that people could ever have been as brilliantly duplicitous as James Wade, until I remind myself that just about every adult human being back then had a brain weighing about 3 kilograms. There was no end to the evil schemes that a thought machine that oversized couldn't imagine and execute. So I raise this question, although there is nobody around to answer it. Can it be doubted that 3-kilogram brains were once nearly fatal defects in the evolution of the human race? A second query, what source was there back then, save for our own over-elaborate nervous circuitry, for the evils we were seeing or hearing about simply everywhere? My answer, there was no other source. This was a very innocent planet, except for those great big brains. I'm not sure if I'm not sure when this theory came to be, but definitely in the last few decades, one of the ideas like in evolution is like, well, why did human beings like develop their intelligence? Was it, is it to cooperate or is it to trick one another? Right. And of course, like there's like, people that fall into specific camps and they're like, it's primarily to trick or it's primarily to cooperate. I'm not sure if this was a theory that was around or was popular in the 80s, but going back to some of the kind of Leonard Shlain art and physics ideas, I think it is kind of telling that in this kind of book about human evolution, the thing that Kurt Vonnegut tries to do is he discusses evolution in a way that anticipates some of this kind of like more modern theorizing about the origins of human intelligence. And it seems like, he's clearly on the side of, we evolved these brains specifically for the purposes of tricking one another and getting ahead, right? And that was the best way to kind of, pass on genetic material, right? Even more so than pure cooperation could get us. But so like just for for anybody listening to this to just keep in mind, right? We start structurally with chapter 1. We have from the purely philosophical stuff to now just this very nice character sketch of weight. And then we're ending once again with like a brief kind of aside, right, on some of the more kind of like philosophical elements in the text, which I think like so far in the book as it's presented, as I'm presenting it here, it's good, right? It's well done. But I do think that later on, it does like become a little like pat, right? And maybe like a little bit repetitive. I'm not sure what your impressions were, but like in this book, it's about 300 pages or so in print. I feel like it probably could have been condensed by maybe like 10 to 20%, right? Because it does tend to start repeating a lot, right? As if like it's like fearing that I might lose like the controlling metaphor. It does tend to dwell on it a lot in similar language, right? Not necessarily always in like new or fresh iterations, right? And this kind of like starts coming about more, it's like more readily visible right after the first few chapters, because he sets down the structure, right? This is already in your brain. You know exactly what the boundaries and the parameters are, where you could go, where maybe you might not want to go. But instead of really pushing it, it's kind of like it does tend to start like repeat some of the same ideas again and again and again.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I also, in terms of things that he overdid, I would also say that like the sort of, I don't know, I guess the meta-fictive aspect of it, the sort of like describing in advance what's going to happen and bracketing out everybody that's going to die and going back to, in the future, people are going to be like this, but for now, oh, well, they're stuck in this bad situation because of those great big brains. Like it does, it definitely feels like he didn't quite know. I mean, who knows what the original draft of this looked like, if it was longer or shorter or whatever, but yeah, it definitely is a little flabby in that way. And also, I mean, it's definitely not an intensely plot-driven book. It's more of a tangent and character and idea-driven book. But it does take a little bit of the tension of the story out, the way that he sort of has to constantly hammer everything about the story, like in every, in almost, if not every chapter, then at least like, every like 10 to 20 page grouping or whatever. I mean, you can, if he had trouble writing this for whatever reason, he can say it was for because he felt like he didn't have a good enough grasp of the biology or whatever, which is weird because there's actually not all that much like biological science in this. It's actually a pretty straightforward understanding of evolution, even for the time. And it's not something he dwelled on very much. So if he could just do that, then it seems maybe more likely that he was struggling like structurally with the book to figure out like what is, I guess, the appropriate amount of the Vonnegut touch, like what is the, like how much can I tell versus how much should I leave for the reader to discover as the as the book is going on, you know, because it's like if you just spoil everything in every moment of the book, then it does, you know, it doesn't necessarily make it a worse book as an art object, but in terms of like reader investment in it, it is certainly going to take that down a peg. And that is something that he does perfectly in other books, you know, like in Breakfast of Champions, he, you know, he spoils that Dwayne Hoover is going to go crazy, but he doesn't necessarily tell you every detail of how that's going to happen. Like at every point in the book before that, you're left on the hook wondering, oh, how could that happen? You know, what's going on? And he's a little, yeah, like you said, pat, I think is the word. He's a little too, it's not, I mean, it's not egregious. It's a little too much. It's definitely, it's one of those books that, again, as our mutual friend Dan has said, like, you can't necessarily learn a lot about writing from like the best works that a great artist produces, because they're almost like hermetically sealed. You know, it's kind of hard to get an in on like how you would come to that idea. This, I mean, I would still say it's a great or a near great book, but the fact that it's kind of on the edge means that you can kind of see the seams a little bit more, and you can kind of understand, like if you were doing something similar to this, how you could change it in a way that would make it a little bit more effective.
Yeah, in fact, you know, as I was reading this, I mean, you know, I've been working on this next novel, and one of the things I'm doing is, you know, like reading this and like seeing that there are scenes that are kind of like, you know, extraneous in some ways, you know, just like superfluous in terms of we've already done this, right? There's no point in going back to it. I'm just like going, you know, by like either stuff that I've written or like, you know, scenes that I've planned. And just like, you know, after reading this book, just like thinking, okay, so what exactly like should I, you know, cut, right? Because if you're like, I need to trust like whatever controlling metaphors that I would have in any book, you need to trust that, right? You need to trust it enough where it does actually work as a controlling metaphor, right? It is like somewhere throughout the book, but B, trusting it means that you're not sort of larding the text like with its presence again and again, especially if it doesn't add, you know, not even like anything new, but like a new dimension, even to like old like categories that you've gone through. So I'm just thinking like, just imagining this book and you cut about maybe 10 to 20% of it, you're going to get a lot more like poetic implication, right? You're going to get scenes that are able to sort of just stand on their own in and of themselves. And the stuff that's kind of like oftentimes around it as a skeleton, kind of like holding it up, it would become like not necessary, right? And you know, maybe as we go through some of these additional chapters, like some like more specific examples might start coming up. But like, yeah, I definitely agree that a book like this, you know, being in the one hand like a really well done book, but also stuff that like you just notice like things could be like done a different way. If you're working on something, right, like similar, like a novel or whatever, you know, it really should be giving you ideas, right? You should never read something where, you know, every chapter doesn't create some kind of judgment within you. Like you should always kind of train yourself to go through material, judging it as you're going along, and also making sure that if you need to adjust your judgments as new information comes to light, you're able to do that too, right? But yeah, these kinds of books are useful for that reason, I'd say.
And maybe just getting in on one other kind of flaw that I noticed is you can definitely tell that like Vonnegut's sense of humor is leaving him a little bit. Like this is just not as like
it's even Slaughterhouse-Five,
even Slaughterhouse-Five, as sad and beautiful as it is like an intensely funny book a lot of the time. And there's a couple of punchlines in here that like I have doubled over in laughter reading Breakfast of Champions before, but the one that really stood out to me as maybe the most egregious example of like dad joke Kurt Vonnegut, I guess, is the only way that you can kind of put it. This is on page 35 in my Kindle edition, but it is in, I don't know what chapter it's in. If I may interject a personal note, I myself had been working as a welder in Malmö for about a year, but the Bahia de Darwin had not yet materialized sufficiently so as to require my services. I would literally lose my head to that steel maiden only when springtime came. Question, who hasn't lost his or her head in the springtime? Like, you can imagine a younger version of Kurt Vonnegut could have come up with something a little more clever to end that paragraph, but it just feels like it feels like an imitation of Vonnegut rather than like, pure, like, prime ripe Vonnegut. You can kind of see that maybe the piquancy of his observations that made him so funny and so trenchant in his earlier books is maybe starting to slip from him a little bit. And I've definitely seen this. I haven't read Hocus Pocus in a long time, but I've read Bluebeard, I've read Timequake, and I have read some of his short stories from his later collections, because that's mostly what he did after this. And he just was never as good as this book again. He never quite had it. He got a little older, and he just, whatever like sharpness and intensity of being made him so good in his younger years, you get older, you kind of, in his case, it seems like he maybe got more depressed and misanthropic, or you kind of just settle in and go like, well, my life's been pretty good, things are okay, I guess. And like the hunger in you that makes you kind of, seek for that fresh little nugget of insight just goes away a little bit.
I mean, in general, this book wasn't, I mean, there were some funny parts, obviously, funny senses, but definitely not as good. Like there's plenty of scenes where like that Mark Twain quote, like the difference between the right word and the almost right word is like the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. There's plenty of that here, right? Where it's like, okay, this is a functional joke. This is objectively, there's humor within the statement, but it's simply not something that's going to make me laugh, especially like, being used to a funnier version of Vonnegut. But I mean, you definitely notice how like the humor here in general just doesn't really stick with you as much. And even like some of the kind of like individual funny lines, right? Or even like the individual kind of like, gut punch lines that stick with you. It's not as much here. Like you like the way that human beings get characterized in Breakfast of Champions, like when he starts talking about babies, right? They're coming into the world screaming and crying for milk. That is such a perfect description of kind of like what motivates people, right? What motivates human waste, what motivates just like, like any kind of trajectory that you would set yourself upon. Most people are motivated by that, right? It's the emotional tantrums from just like living, and this craving for, you need to find some kind of nourishment. And even if we have total nourishment and, we would never like go hungry in many places in the West, now there's like this, like, if you're satisfied in that way, you need an overnourishment, right? You need to now get fat. You need another kind of comfort. So there's really not as much stuff like that here, right? Like, as we were going through, like, I mean, we could just compare like my original notes for Cat's Cradle versus what I sent here. Like, I just can't find that many like individual sentences that would really stick with me,
Well, also, I mean, you can see him. I mean, I would say that the use of quotations from this
that's another thing.
Pocket supercomputer called Mandarax. It is sometimes very effective, and it does serve like a philosophical function in the novel, which is to sort of like, here is all this accumulated human wisdom over time condensed into this thing that ends up on the bottom of the ocean, and it becomes functionally useless to what humanity eventually becomes. It serves a clear thematic and philosophical and aesthetic function in the book, but it's just not as memorable, and it's not as well done, and it's not as funny as the Bakonin little poems that are interspersed throughout Cat's
Yeah.
Cradle. You
Yeah.
know, it's just
They don't
it
stick with
feels
you.
like a
Exactly.
worse version of that.
Yeah, like I mean, like there's a lot that you could say in terms of like keeping, the Mandarak's idea, right? I mean, like one of the I think most effective parts of it is that as the book goes on, it becomes less and less relevant, right, to everybody. Even if you have like Mary that's still kind of like fixated on it, she still like wants to talk to it. There's like a new society forming, and it becomes just like less and less relevant to everybody, right? And it's sort of fitting that it's like this one, like guy with like dementia, right? This captain who just like in a fit of rage just like throws it into the ocean, right? That is a kind of like fitting end for some of the commentary that's being done in the book about human progress, about human aspirations, about sort of human self-definitions. But individually, the way that the Mandarak should be like supported in the text throughout is like, yeah, by use of those quotations, like what will these quotations do for the book, for like the way that a chapter maybe opens or ends. And yeah, many of them they both propel the narrative forward and also just kind of give like pithy sort of like explanations of things, or like make you see things in a new light. But many of the quotes used are just kind of like, yeah, I get why they would be used. It makes sense. It's logical, but it's not necessarily memorable, right? It's not so like even like when you follow the trajectory of this device, like from its appearance to when it's ultimately destroyed, you see all the logical reasons why it would be used. You see some of the individual elements where it works, but just the way that it's like buoyed up right throughout the text, like those individual iterations and instantiations, they don't really work that well all the time,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's another example of like some prudent pruning would have made it more effective, because
you could
if you did
eliminate
it
some
less,
quotes easily. Yeah, you could just
if it was like if you just had picked the ones that landed the best, that maybe instead of just being like, you didn't feel like writing a paragraph there, so you let the quote do the work. Like it's the ones that have some kind of an ironic application, or just maybe it was like summed it up as best you could, or it was just this sort of like covering of like, here is how all of accumulated human wisdom is like funneling into this moment where the species is essentially like hitting the reset button. Like there's a way in which it could be like, it's not that it's not effective, but there's a way in which it could clearly be more effective, and he has demonstrated it in other books. And it's the same thing. He did a different thing that was effective in Breakfast of Champions with the cute little drawings. Like he doesn't overdo that in that book either. Like there's just enough that it is pretty consistently amusing and efficacious. Here and in many ways, like I think it as like there's nothing I can like just reading the book as itself, divorcing it from like Vonnegut and like as the author or whatever. Like there's not a lot you can specifically complain about, other than maybe it's just a little too verbose and he could have done some pruning. But when you compare it to Cat's Cradle, it does it feels like a retread of Cat's Cradle, including like the apocalypse. It's like the story of the last survivors of apocalypse. And Cat's Cradle went all out and just said, nope, humanity's done. These are people just sort of living in a dream world of like whatever remains of their existence. And here it's a little more hopeful in that it imagines that like there is a reset button for humanity that is at least theoretically possible, that could lead them to a more harmonious existence with themselves and circumstances. But it's a little bit like, when you read it in its corpus, it's kind of like the difference between Goodfellas and Casino in Scorsese's oeuvre. It's not that Casino is a bad movie. In fact, it's an excellent, maybe even a great movie if you just read it on its own. But in a world where Goodfellas and Mean Streets exists, it just feels kind of like, okay, you're dipping back into the well a little bit. You know, you're doing the same thing, but it's a little more bloated. It's a little less poetic. You know, I mean, there are some people who would say that it's more memorable, but I think it's objectively left less of a pop cultural imprint. Like, you have to be a little hipsterish to be like, oh, Casino is the better movie of the two. You know, like it's just not quite as good.
A lot of people say that, though, the Casino is better because they want to be hipsters. I watched it again, like maybe like a year ago, and one thing that struck me is just how I forget the name of the character. It's the protagonist, right? The Robert De Niro character, but how he essentially gets entangled with this woman that like causes his downfall, but it was so like, it's so obvious, I think, to like any viewer that this is really where things are going on the one hand. And it's also just very surprising that in a movie about gangsters, there is like somebody there's like ostensibly like high enough, in this hierarchy, that has, like a very obvious weakness that did not kill him, years and years ago. Right. But now it's so like, and you notice like something like that, right? Like in the Scorsese universe, that is a big enough flaw where you just kind of like, you would expect like a character like that to have like, succumb to these things like before we even see this character on the screen, right? Before he could even be put on the screen. Here you have like something like weirdly analogous where like if you look at the Wikipedia page for Galapagos, one of the things that they make a big deal about, and they tally it for whatever reason, they give you a list of all the famous people, right, like writers or like whoever, politicians, whatever, that the Mandarax takes quotes from, right? And again, like you know exactly what the idea is, right? Just like in the same way that that in Casino, the idea is we're going to present this like, femme fatale that's like fucked up in her own ways as a downfall character. But you also understand that, okay, so if we have like a list of all these quotations and all these people responsible for these quotations, and this is supposed to be like the history of humanity, fine, I get with the logical purposes, but again, too many quotes, many of them not necessarily doing what they ought to be doing, right? Or they're just doing, repeats of what other quotes did like right before. And, you need to keep things like that fresh if this is going to be one of the ideas. And I think one of the best parts here is like how Darwin gets kind of analyzed like early in the book, and also the implications for the rest of the book. Like this is in chapter 3, so this is after James Wade is introduced. We're now in chapter 3. There's like more of that philosophy that returns, and the way that Darwin's theory gets characterized is like this: there was a portrait of Darwin behind the bar of the El Dorado, framed in shelves and bottles, an enlarged reproduction of a steel engraving depicting him not as a youth in the islands, but as a portly family man back home in England, with a beard as lush as a Christmas wreath. The same portrait was on the bosom of T-shirts for sale in the boutique, and Wade had bought 2 of those. That was what Darwin looked like when he was finally persuaded by friends and relatives to set down on paper his notions of how life forms everywhere, including himself and his friends and relatives, and even his queen, had come to be as they were in the 19th century. He thereupon penned the most broadly influential scientific volume produced during the entire era of great big brains. It did more to stabilize people's volatile opinions of how to identify success or failure than any other tome. Imagine that, right? And I mean, I thought this was like a perfect way to describe that part of the theory, the way that people have responded to it. And also just kind of like, you could get a lot out of this description, right? It did more to stabilize people's volatile opinions of how to identify success or failure than any other tome. Like this is so applicable to so many areas of life, right? Beyond like the purely, the purely Darwinian sense of doing things to reproduce, right? Because we have so many proxies for success, right? I mean, like wealth obviously is a proxy for success, partly because having access to wealth gives you access to women, which gives you access to children, right? It always goes back, right, to those kind of like reductive terms. But like success more broadly, right? Proxies that are kind of like less obviously even tied to wealth. They're also being interpreted in broadly Darwinian terms by people all over the planet today.
Yeah. Well, also, the thing about Darwin is, despite the theory of evolution having been like a landmark thing in the sciences, and arguably one of the greatest contributors to like true secularization of society in the last 200 years, like essentially people just used it to reinforce whatever it was they already believed in the first place. Mm-hmm. Like if you're there are people who take it as like this proof of like pure relativity, and like and social conditioning and things like that. All success and failure is entirely determined by your circumstances, and it's not that there was anything wrong with you. It's just you were not born into circumstances fortuitous to your whatever, so we all have to help you. Or if you're on the more right wing or fasci end, it's like, well, no, success or failure is rewarded. So if somebody has succeeded or failed, then it's because it is because of them. They are either fit for the circumstances or they are not, and we shouldn't waste so much emotion on people's failures because it's what was supposed to happen. And you see a mirror of that too with the fact that this guy, who was a scientist who contributed to knowledge, for its own. I mean, he did write a book that was sold, but he wasn't doing it to sell books specifically. It has been like commodified and turned into like the mascot of this hotel and this cruise, and
like it's in between bottles, right? Yeah, like it's like a portrait between bottles and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's like it's like both true and ironic at the same time. Like it did convince a lot of people of the rightness of what they also believed, but it also didn't actually influence them because they just kept believing what they always believed. It was stabilizing in the sense that it gives people a like objective branch to grab onto in like self-justifying their behavior to themselves.
Yeah.
Actually, I think there's a good. You stopped right before what I think is actually like a pretty good joke, which is right after "Imagine That." He says, "And the name of this book summed up its pitiless contents on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life."
Yeah.
Like describing on the origin of species as being full of pitiless contents is that's a pretty classic Vonnegut line.
Yeah. Do you have, because I have some more on the kind of like do you have any comments on like the broader kind of financial crisis and like how Vonnegut is spinning it, right? Like there's this thing on in chapter 15, like money and value, right? Like it's imaginary, it's so weightless and impalpable that any amount of it could be transferred instantly to Ecuador, right? Like it seems like it's a presaging of many of the critiques, right, that we hear today about capitalism, right, where you have like this like phantom value that might have been actually, on people's minds in the 80s when the book was written. I believe 1986 is when it was published. And we had a financial downturn. I think it was in 88 or 89, not in 86, but like there was definitely this feeling like in the 80s starting that with all these like new complex financial instruments, like we're getting further and further away, right, from actual like day-to-day palpable value, right? Stuff that is measurable, especially in terms of like truly being productive, right? Not measurable in terms of what people are willing to pay for whatever, but stuff that is like objectively like productive assets, right? We were getting further and further away from that by the time the 80s, even before like like financial downturns made people kind of like more aware of it. It was still kind of like discussed in like pop media at the time, movies like American Psycho, stuff like that. I don't know if you had anything else to say on that, because like after this point, he sort of like slows down from any more discussions of like of money and value in those terms.
No, I mean, I don't have a lot to add to that. I mean, he also talks about it vis-a-vis the environment quite a bit as well. And I mean, the 1980s, I mean, knowledge of global warming has been around arguably since like the late 1800s when it was first theorized, but certainly the 80s is when you really started seeing it kind of start to popularize. And so I think putting both of those things like in play here is yeah, I mean, he's honestly, I mean, it seems like he was basically in some ways it's actually a very sobering thing, because here's someone in 1986 that seems very concerned about the exact same things that we on the left or the left adjacent sphere are very concerned about right now. And yet it's 30 years later and very little progress has been made on any of this. And we're also in kind of a Chicken Little mode a little bit as a culture, where we feel like everything is coming to an end right now. But in all likelihood, it's just going to be 30 more years of the same like neurosis and anxiety about the exact same thing.
Yeah, I agree.
So the big brains.
Yeah. Speaking of big brains, like I thought like what was like one of the most effective uses of the big brain controlling metaphor. This is a chapter. This is chapter 14, pages 66, 67, if anybody is doing this edition. So this is like talking about the last marriage in the Galapagos. The last human marriage in the Galapagos Islands, and thus the last one on Earth, was performed for Nandina Island in the year 23,011. Nobody today has any idea what a marriage is. I have to say that Mandarax's cynicism about the institution back in its heyday was largely justified. My own parents made each other miserable by getting married, and Mary Hepburn, when she was an old lady on Santa Rosalia, once told the furrier Kiko that she and Roy had been, quite possibly, the only happily married couple in all of Ilium. What made marriage so difficult back then was yet another was again that instigator of so many other sorts of heartbreak, the oversized brain. That cumbersome computer could hold so many contradictory opinions on so many different subjects all at once, and switch from one opinion or subject to another one so quickly that a discussion between a husband and wife under stress could end up like a fight between blindfolded people wearing roller skates. The Hiraguchis, for example, whose susurrations Mary had heard through the back of her closet, were then changing their opinions of themselves and each other, and of love and sex and work and the world and so on, with lightning speed. In 1 second, Hisako would think that her husband was very stupid and that she was going to have to rescue herself and her female fetus. But then in the next second, she would think that he was as brilliant as everybody said he was, and that she could just stop worrying, that he would get them out of his mess very easily and soon. In 1 second, Zenji was inwardly cursing her for her helplessness, for being such a dead weight, and in the next, he was vowing in his head to die if necessary for this goddess and her unborn daughter. Of what possible use was such emotional volatility, not to say craziness, in the heads of animals who were supposed to stay together long enough, at least, to raise a human child, which took about 14 years or so? Right. So, this is like one of the more effective ways of using this kind of like big brain idea, because I mean, obviously, like, it's very relatable, right? People have been in all sorts of arguments with their whether it's like their spouses or whoever, right? And you see your own kind of volatility like play out, probably every day, right? Even if you don't necessarily express an opinion, right? You might have like a stray thought that is in contradiction to some of the things that you believe or some of the things that you think that you believe or you want to believe, right? What does this do to you psychologically? What happens when some of these opinions that perhaps should not be vocalized because maybe they don't have anything to do with reality, if they are vocalized, like what effect does that actually have on your day-to-day life? Like is there like a point of no return, right? So yeah, I found that to be like one of the more effective uses of this idea, right, throughout the text. And he just limiting it to just specifically these kinds of sketches, especially if they're used to kind of like propel character forward, I think would have been like the wiser choice. And I guess like another thing that we could ask in relation to all this is whether it's like James Wade or some of these other characters, to what extent are these like full human beings, right, versus just kind of like things that Vonnegut uses, characters to kind of like propel ideas forward, as opposed to propel some of their kind of like natural dynamics. Because I mean, to me, they definitely do have tons of like truly human qualities. Like at his best characterization here, these are some excellent sketches, right? They are hyper realistic. Like this, what I just described, is hyper realistic. And in the remainder of the chapter, he goes through like an actual interaction that these characters have. And but by not giving everything to the reader, I think that's also a good technique. Like when she's like thinking about Zenji, right? Like thinking like, wait, is he as brilliant as I believe that as others believe that he is, right? Or is there something more to it? Like she's probably having that thought, although we can't tell, because we don't really see too many interactions between them up until this point. Probably what she's thinking is, okay, I'm in this like fucked up situation with this ship. There's this, there's all this stuff going on. How can I save myself? My husband, he's not able to save me because his head, for as smart as he is, like it's always in the clouds, right? It's always involved in everything other than everyday reality that we're dealing with right now. Right. And this is kind of implied, right? Like we know that he's a computer programmer. We know that might be what the implication is. We know that he's probably not ever been in this kind of situation. So we probably do understand why her reaction is as volatile as it is, right? Like his specific sort of advantages, like back in Japan, might not be very useful in this new kind of situation. So his like wonderful intelligence, right, is useless here, and this is creating this emotional volatility in herself, right? And it's not really spelled out to you, but you're left like with enough sketches where you could draw that conclusion on your own before you even get their interactions.
Also a nice mirroring of the evolution theme there, the idea that an adaptation that is successful in one environment can be useless and a hindrance in a different environment. But the way that Vonnegut does characters is like to me, his characters always feel like they're not, this is not like kitchen sink realism. Mm-hmm. This is not like stream of consciousness where you're meant to just really get inside the head of the character. He gives sort of like a light sketch of the character, enough that you can kind of, enough detail that they're not generic, but not so much that you can't kind of fill in the blanks yourself. It's almost like one of those optical, or not, it's not, I don't know if it's optical illusion, but like one of those drawings where it's like you need to take a sec to sort of see what it is, because it uses kind of as few lines as possible. But once you see it, it's very obvious what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's, and going back to earlier critiques, he doesn't do that any worse in this book than he does in any other book. But because it's a little less poetic and a little bit more prosaic, it does not land quite as much as it does in other books, because what his often more spare or poetic style does is it creates a very solid base on which to hang these like sort of like ornamented characterizations. It creates a like there's already something very solid in your head and beautiful in your head that these all plug into very perfectly. It's like I went to a pumpkin festival with my family last night because my nephew wanted to go, and there was there were individually carved pumpkins, but there are always also these like kind of grandiose pumpkin sculptures where if you looked at any individual pumpkin it wouldn't make any sense, but there is a way that they are arranged that makes them resemble something else, and the whole is much more beautiful than the sum of their parts. And so by being a little flabbier with the prose here, he sort of makes it so it's kind of there's a less clear sense of what he's going for and a less controlled arrangement of everything. Yeah. And when you do that kind of control, it almost like it creates things that you didn't even intend probably, because it just fits together so perfectly that you can kind of marvel at it, and it will reflect different angles will reflect different things, and that'll change through time as the environment that the book is situated in, as the society around it changes. That's why something like Moby Dick stands out as like exceptionally modern and relevant today in a way that most books from the 1800s just don't.
Yeah. Do you have like any I have a few more notes here about later chapters, things that we could talk about. Was there like something else that was like pressing to you that you wanted to bring up?
Well, it's not a huge point, but I was going to say earlier that I guess a nice application of his authorial godliness, that the thing that gets Mary Hepburn killed is that she is going to retrieve this, special supercomputer from the water when the dementia-addled Adolf throws it into the water because he doesn't remember her, but he remembers that he hates that fucking computer with this like very small amount of noise that it makes. And she gets eaten by a shark after she retrieves it, which is a little unrealistic because that's not actually how great white sharks behave. But it's funny enough. But the fact that it's unrealistic is kind of like also Vonnegut showing his hand a little bit, like that it's not quite what he was. It's a little too screwball for a Kurt Vonnegut story. But it, like in the story, what it shows is she has made this new life for herself on this island, and she's become sort of a respected matriarch, but she can't give up this last remnant of the old society that she doesn't even know is a society that is in the process of dying, like as she is on this island. She just assumes that everything is going on, but for the fact that she goes to retrieve it and try to bring back this accumulated wisdom of this world that almost destroyed itself, she is punished, not punished, but that's what she gets for doing it, and so that's a nice touch, and it ties into the mild biblicality of everything. Well,
speaking of Mandarex, I think the best use of the machine here, probably the most poetic use, was in the same chapter. So like the Japanese couple, they're arguing with each other, and so the wife, right, she does like she Hisako, she does the ikebana thing, which is like Japanese like flower arrangement art, I guess. Like it's like a small kind of like arts and crafts thing going on, and it seems like one of the conflicts in their relationship is that he maybe doesn't like respect what she does like as an art or whatever, and part of that suspicion is it starts to like come to the fore, right? When Mandrax starts to like explain how to do these flower arrangements, right? And she starts feeling like, you know, superfluous, like why am I necessary in this world, right? If like this machine could do this for me, which, you know, it's like a classic kind of like, you know, Vonnegut trope, right? He's often either directly, you know, talking about automation, like in that novel Player Piano, or he's kind of like doing it by implication. So um, the way that this is described is, so Mandarax, she said, turns out to be a very good teacher of the art of flower arranging. That was what she had been so proud of being, of course. But her self-respect had been severely crippled by the discovery that a little black box could not only teach what she taught, but could do so in 1,000 different tongues. I was going to tell you, I meant to tell you, he said. This was another lie, and her learning that Mandarax knew Ikebana was as improbable as her guessing the combination to a bank vault. She had been very reluctant to learn how to work Mandarax and would remain so until she died. But by golly, if she hadn't fiddled with the buttons there on the Omu until suddenly Mandarax was telling her that the most beautiful flower arrangements had one, two, or at the most three elements. In arrangements of three elements, said Mandarax, all three might be the same, or two of the three might be the same, but all three should never be different. Mandarax told her the ideal ratios between the altitudes of the elements and arrangements of more than one element, and between the elements and the diameters and altitudes of their vases or bowls, or sometimes baskets. A cabana turned out to be as easily codified as the practice of modern medicine. And I thought this was probably the best use overall, right, of Mandarax here, partly because there's a lot, you know, there's a characterization that flows from it. There's this kind of like overall thematic thrust that flows from it, right, in the sense that like, yes, humanity gets to start over, right, if you want to still call that humanity, but like, what is the point, right? That seems to be the kind of like concluding feature of some of the book, right? It's not just the hopefulness, it's also the, well, so what? Like, are you simply going to, you know, develop you know, another form of intelligence and go down the same route, right? That you know, made you essentially go extinct almost, right, from the beginning. So yeah, so
well, it's in some ways Vonnegut's most pessimistic book, actually, because it's sort of like he's so fed up with the problems and the breakdown of society and the environment that he almost can't see a way out other than humans just become like evolving into a simpler creature without as much intelligence and just more rudimentary rooted relationship to the world and to their environment. So but yeah, that is pretty, you know, a pretty classic Vonnegut concern, like, because it's not just the automation itself, it's like people sort of realizing that this thing that they've invested so much of themselves in is actually like relatively simple when you break it down and you do the pieces apart. I mean, it requires the wisdom of experience to know how to do it truly properly, but like, you know, ultimately, like we assign a lot of ego and vanity to our endeavors in order to maybe ignore the fact that we're not doing it for whatever high-minded reasons. We do it for ourselves, and we're not always doing it with this, like, you know, intense intelligence. Like, we're often behaving as algorithmically as any computerized information transmission would. You know, but we can't handle that, and so we have to sort of invent drama and tell stories to ourselves around it in order to justify this expenditure of time to ourselves.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
he has this like interesting like flirtation with you know, I guess a kind of like biological Well, maybe it is kind of biological determinism. Maybe there's something else going on. On page 82, this is chapter 16. This is the way that he's just describing these characters, right? So I mean, these are like ostensibly like, like supposed to be like human-like characters, human beings on this ship. And the way that he describes this crew is, if Selena was nature's experiment with blindness, then her father was nature's experiment with heartlessness. Yes, and Jesus Ortiz was nature's experiment with admiration for the rich, and I was nature's experiment with insatiable voyeurism, and my father was nature's experiment with cynicism, and my mother was nature's experiment with optimism, and the captain of the Bahia de Darwin was nature's experiment with ill-founded self-confidence, and James Waite was nature's experiment with purposeless greed, and Hisako Hiraguchi was nature's experiment with depression, and Akiko was nature's experiment with furriness, and on and on. And I mean, like just like if you want to think about it for a moment and maybe just like draw this out, see where it goes. Human beings, especially in the modern world, right, where you don't have to like just default to like ancestral states, right? Perhaps a 5'8" male, right, in the ancestral environment would have been a lot less liable to survive than today. Perhaps you being a 7 foot 5 inch male don't have as many special advantages, right, in this world, right, compared to some of the advantages that you might have had, centuries before, where like raw, just physical presence would have been more important, right? Whereas like, these days you could, you could get by, right, much better on many other advantages simply because, like we've sort of like, or we kind of like pretend, right, like that like physical presence should not be the thing that determines, sorts of life outcomes, for example. But like, in the modern world, like we have so many niches where we could succeed, right? And we could succeed not only by like, the typical Darwinian proxies of wealth and reproduction and stuff like that, but there's like other kinds of ways that you could acquire success. And on some level, like if you atomize it just hard enough, right, you go further and further into this territory, like, is it true that human beings have all sort of found these kinds of niches, right, and biology is just there kind of in the background, forcing you into these experiments, and then after you're experimented upon, you're sort of let loose in the world, right, and you have to find that niche, right, you have to find that place where that experiment that worked out in that specific way in your life, in your particular instantiation, right? You're supposed to find that niche and you're supposed to find success within it.
Yeah, well, for some reason, as you were talking, my brain was also going to the concept of intelligent design as well, that sort of somewhat defunct concept. But when you phrase it like this, it really does make the idea of intelligent design like it's actually less coherent than creationism, even though it takes into account like the scientific like facts of biology that make the theory of evolution our best explanation of the diversity of life in this planet, because like if the whole point of everything was for it to result in us, on what basis would God engage in all these other like side experiments? Did he not know that it was going to work? Like the only way that intelligent design makes sense is if it was not in fact intended to result in us, but it was some sort of like powerful but not all-knowing figure that was just sort of experimenting with some sort of synthetic reality that it had gained power over, and just seeing what happened if it tweaked things just a little bit over time. So, but I mean, the whole idea of experimentation, I mean, that's just, I mean, the reason that humans do experiments is to increase their knowledge and to amuse themselves, basically. It is I mean, everything we do that is not eating and sleeping and fucking and building shelter is like just a way to pass the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just a way to make the fact that we are on this planet for 80 to 90 to 100 years, you know, more to divert our brains while we were doing that and try to find some enrichment and understanding. So like to the extent that you can talk about like nature experimenting, like that's the universe kind of blindly doing the same thing, or maybe not blindly, who knows the nature of reality, but it's just sort of like things happening because they can happen and because it's slightly more interesting than if they didn't happen.
Yeah.
You know, and it's but I did, you know, that I did think that I thought that passage when you were reading it went on just a little bit too long. You know, that's just another kind of feature of the novel, but you know, conceptually it's good, and it also, you know, it's the kind of thing that probably more people should read to maybe understand themselves aside from their egos a little bit, you know, to understand that like whatever you are, it's, you know, just it's nature. Ultimately what you are is nature trying something out to see if there is any sort of increased survivability that is introduced to some collection of genetic material, either yours or someone else's, that your existence introduces into the fray. You know, it's like, don't delude yourself about yourself too much or you're going to lose the plot.
Yeah. Speaking of that, later on in the book, page 102, there's this like discussion like of like overt morality and the kinds of things that people say to themselves, right, to kind of like justify either behaviors or like a certain kind of like mode of existence, which we could talk about here and also just a later scene. So there's this businessman on the trip, right, Macintosh, who, you know, he's presented also as a kind of like sociopath, right? He's also evil in many ways, but he goes on this kind of like spree where he's justifying his life choices, right, by kind of like whitewashing them through like a kind of like faux activism, right? And there's this part, right? So there in Elaine's restaurant, Macintosh angered his spellbound audience with tales of boots crushing the camouflage nest of iguanas, of greedy fingers stealing the eggs of boobies, and on and on. His most moving atrocity story by far, though, again lifted from the National Geographic, was of persons cradling fur seal pups in their arms as though they were human infants, for the sake of photographs. When the pup was returned to its mother, he said bitterly, she would no longer nurse it because its smell had been changed. So what happens to that darling pup, which has just had the great honor of being cuddled by a big-hearted nature lover? Asked Macintosh. It starves to death, all for the sake of a photograph. So his answer to Bobby King's question was that he was setting a good example he hoped others would follow by taking, quote, the nature cruise of the century. It is a joke to me that this man should have presented himself as an ardent conservationist, since so many of the companies he served as a director or in which he was a major stockholder were notorious damagers of the water or the soil or the atmosphere. But it wasn't a joke to Macintosh, who had come into this world incapable of caring much about anything. So in order to hide this deficiency, he had become a great actor, pretending even to himself that he cared passionately about all sorts of things. With the same degree of conviction, he had earlier given his daughter an entirely different explanation of why they were going to the islands and the Bahia de Darwin instead of the Omu, right? And I mean, this is like so kind of like true of you know, like so much of like charitable, you know, contribution type activism, right?
Yeah.
I mean, partly because like they, you know, like we had this like new regime, right, where you could like, you know, write off so much garbage, right? I think for 2020, right, they allowed you to like literally like making any kind of donation, you could write it off up to 100% of your income, right? You could finish the movement, right, of resources from the commons completely into the private sphere, right? Allowing completely the private sphere to take over all of these kinds of operations that ought to be done by the government. And government is doing this willingly, right? And people are also like far too willing themselves to kind of like they delude themselves into thinking that this is that this is kind of like the way that the world can be moved forward, right? And there's like any number of justifications that occur along the way, right? And along the way, what I mean by that is all this other stuff is just en route to the actual conclusion, right? Which is like, for most people, they just want access to something that would allow them to like titillate themselves and to like just self-indulge forever, right? This is what really moves people so often, right? Like how can you set up your life where everything could just be self-indulgence? And this is one of the ways that this happens, right? You do these kinds of things, and then along the way you whitewash it, right? You whitewash it through money, right? Which is the thing that you do when you don't want to give your time, when you don't want to give any real energy to anything valuable. You whitewash your own deficiencies in that way through money, right? And this kind of idea comes up in this book.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you just go down a list, like every fucking like quote unquote charitable billionaire is doing something, or probably many things, in their portfolio that is actively creating or contributing to the problem that they are ostensibly trying to solve with their charitable donations.
Yeah.
And so not only do they get the money from the unpriced externalities that result from the economic activity that gave them their billions in the first place, but they get the public credit for helping to solve it. Like, Bill Gates, with all his public health initiatives in the global south, like how much public health crises has he created from like all the rare earth, rare mineral extraction that has to be done in all of these global south countries in order to create all of the pieces of the computers that he made his money selling in the first place. When you look at like Warren Buffett and George Soros, like they do all this stuff, all these charitable things, and they're advocating for liberal policies and higher taxes on billionaires and whatever. But how much of the very problem of like inequitable distribution of resources was generated by their own like speculative financial by financial accumulation in the first place? I mean, it's like a closed loop in terms of like them retaining their hegemonic place within the system. Maybe not totally hegemonic, but they're way over privileged and over influential place in the system of human activity that does nothing but increase their reputations, while totally undeservingly. But I mean, everybody, I mean, the thing is, like, there's no way to avoid like ulterior motives in anything you do, because your brain is a many-sided thing, and it doesn't do anything unless it wants to do it. Like even something altruistic, you get the benefit of feeling good.
Yeah.
You get the benefit of feeling like you're helping with something. And unless you're living on a self-sustaining like experimental farm in Guayaquil or something like that, you are in all likelihood like contributing to the very thing that you think that you're helping with your altruism. But I mean, there is no way of escaping ulterior motives, but I do think there is at least a theoretical way of organizing that, like, the ulterior motives do not become like a way of people like oppressing other people on like a systemic level. You're never going to eliminate like hierarchy and a certain amount of like interpersonal exploitation and taking advantage of other people, but certainly it doesn't have to be the guiding light of an economy. And part of the genesis of this book, I think, is that if like society had reached a point where Vonnegut himself, or at least his authorial overvoice or whatever, couldn't any longer see much of a way out of it. You know, like things had progressed to a point where it didn't seem like people were going to get any better and things around them were going to get much worse.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, like, in general, right? You want to, well, like what people can and should eliminate, right, is this kind of like mass scale suffering, right? It's not the interpersonal things, right? It's not that, you know, we want to, like, for instance, like, you know, you don't want to ban, like, you know, the individual decision to like take drugs or whatever, right? You want to simply like eliminate that, right? You can't like pass some sort of law where, you know, a mature person and an immature person cannot start a relationship because, you know, the mature person can, you know, more easily like exploit the immature one. Like, that's not what we're talking about, right? But just foundationally, so much of just, you know, everything that we're in, everything that we're dealing with, it comes from these like, you know, deeper roots of exploitation that need to be mitigated, because that's always the sort of like default desire that human beings would have as soon as, you know, those options are made available to them.
Yeah, well, and also like the whole idea of like eliminating suffering is correct, but you know, we live extremely privileged lives here in the modern 21st century West in terms of like how many sources of want we have essentially been delivered from by technology and by even by our form of economic organization. But you know, like we have plenty of extra people that could be doing good work, and plenty of people even now that like could be doing stuff to help alleviate suffering. But and I hate to bring this up because game theory is always like a real dumb guy shit to talk about, especially nowadays where you have people doing like Twitter threads about it and shit. But like game theoretically, people are also perfectly justified in not doing that, because if other people don't do it as well, then you are essentially like depriving yourself toward no actually like effective end, you know? So it ends in like a net negative to yourself, and the only way that you can really do it at this point is to just, I guess, take enough pleasure in that act of like self-denial and self-sacrifice that it makes up for like all the other pleasure that you otherwise would have experienced. But only a few people are going to come to that calculation in the absence of like a truly coordinated effort where everybody is like agreed that this is what we're going to do, you know? So it's a real, like, I can see why Vonnegut was maybe as pessimistic as he was at that point, because I mean, in some ways, in terms of the like frivolousness that undergirds everything, like the 80s were not dissimilar to now, you know, like where everything just felt like an experiment in like, how much money can we make off of pure frivolousness? I mean, you had stuff like that in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s as well, but it does feel like we got a reprieve with the fall of the Soviet Union and the like end of history and experimenting with like, you know, can we militarily deliver democracy to the rest of the world, to the places that have not yet adopted it? You know, there was sort of something for us to focus on, but now that that's been taken away because we realized it was a disaster, it's like, well, there's really not much else to do other than to just, you know, to what is it the Neil Postman book that's called like Amusing Ourselves to Death? There's not anything else to do. So
Yeah.
it's a real fucking hard nugget to crack, man.
Yeah, this kind of like self-amusement, right? Yeah, it's interesting because you have like so many possible like sources of stimuli, right? And like oftentimes like I want to be, you know, I want to be productive when I do stuff. So it's like, all right, if I'm gonna go take a walk, and if I'm walking a couple hours a day, I want to, you know, I want to be listening to a book, or I want to be like just like something, like I need something, I need something in my like chittering in my brain. And like recently, like I remember like just distinctly feeling yesterday, I was like, all right, I want to go take another walk now, and thinking, yeah, I don't have to take anything with me, right? I don't need anything chittering in my brain. I don't need this because I was like in the middle of like choosing, okay, what am I going to choose for my walk, right? And I had like too many fucking options. And I started getting overwhelmed. I was like, I'm not gonna do shit. I just need to like walk and just be, in my own head, not have anybody else's influences, right? And more and more, this is exactly what we're getting, right? We're getting this like platter of things that are very, they're all like similar to one another, right? All the individual items are often just they kind of like meld into like one thing, right? And then ultimately, it doesn't really matter what you pick, right? There's, on the one hand, so much plenty. There's also like an illusion of plenty that goes on, and there's like so much in between as well, right? There's so many in between states, getting from one point to the other. Um, Also, like we were talking about, like, so like what are some of the kind of like maybe more memorable elements? And I think maybe the thing that stuck with me the most in terms of like individual lines that you could really build towards other things is he has this one line about sculpture, right? Oh yeah, this is a page 187 through 190, chapter 34. So like thinking about like where society is like after this collapse, right? This is what Vonnegut, or rather Leon Trout, says: no one is interested in sculpture these days. Who could handle a chisel or a welding torch with their flippers or their mouths? Right. So he turns it into like a joke, or kind of like, of course people aren't interested in sculpture, right? They don't have the hands for it, right? They don't have the physical equipment for it. But it strikes me as something that is so applicable to like so many things outside of like this one specific joke. It's not merely that human beings now have flippers and they can't, they can't work with plaster any longer. uh it's a question that you could ask in general, right? Why are we no longer interested in X, right? And there is always like some kind of explanation, right? Here he needs the kind of like default physical explanation because that's like the plot of the book. But in general, I mean, we could ask the same question: why aren't people interested in sculpture? It's a relevant question, right? There's not much going on in the world of sculpture when you look at the kinds of things that capture the imagination. I remember recently, there was this like whole thing with these right wing like pickup artist types on Twitter. They were like going on and on and on about this like fucking like sculpture that they found, right? And it's like a sculpture of this like woman, and it was like very very detailed, and it had like all this it clearly, like, it takes like some level of technical skill to do the sculpture, but as a work of art there really wasn't much to it. But these pickup artists and red pillars, they just kept going on and on about like um only a man could do a sculpture like this because only a man could be this worshipful of women, right? Look at all the details, look at all the beautiful little things that he's thinking about. Turn out to be like I think it's like a lesbian sculptor from China. But it just struck me as very interesting how like this sculpture that really didn't have too much going on artistically, suddenly these people that ostensibly have absolutely zero interest in art, they're all like piling on the sculpture to talk about how wonderful it is for all the wrong reasons, because they don't have a reason, right, to be in the art world, but they have some sort of like ideological axe to grind. They have a certain of ideas and titillations that they want to satisfy, like their own like little beliefs about the world. So they latch onto this sculpture. But in general, obviously they're not interested in sculptures. Like, you could ask that question: why aren't people interested in sculpture? Unless A, it's the red pillars that want to make some kind of point about their red pill ideology, or B, all the people replying to them: oh, by the way, you fucking like right wing cards, you this is actually a Chinese woman, right, that did the sculpture. Like, that's their like response to the art, right? Again, like nothing to do with the art, nothing to do with anything. Like, why aren't people interested in sculpture? Let's just leave it at that.
Well, also, and then there's also the other sculpture related incident was when they put the fearless girl statue in front of the Wall Street Bull.
Oh,
Uh,
I don't really remember.
yeah. So while I think in on Wall Street, there's been like you know, a pretty good sculpture of a bull like writhing and fighting or something like that, which is of course an evocation of a bull market. But at some point, there was a statue that was made of like a little girl kind of standing up, doing like the Superman pose,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like a small like life-ish size statue. And I don't know who put it there, but they put it in front of the bull statue
Yeah.
so that it looked like a larger piece, you know, like she was standing up to the bull or whatever. And you know, you had all of these people, and again, it was mostly like alt-right people being like, "Oh, this is just feminist drivel. You're changing the original sculpture, blah blah blah," and other people that, like, also just defending it from the other direction of like, "No, this is feminine obstinacy standing up against like masculine aggression and callous disregard or whatever." And it's like, nobody was actually talking about this from like an artistic perspective. They
Yeah.
were just talking about it from whatever culture war bullshit, frivolous ish, perspective that they already had. There was no, and the thing is, like, the fearless girl sculpture, wasn't all that impressive of a sculpture, and the
Mm.
bull sculpture is kind of impressive, like, but
Yeah,
I don't know. It's just,
the newest one there. This was, I think, like last week. There was an ape statue that was put in front of the bull statue, and
mhm,
like 1,000 bananas
yeah,
around the bull, right?
yeah,
Ape meaning like this is like, I guess, what artists thought was some sort of like, worthwhile evocation of the current moment of like meme stocks and meme coins, right? We're gonna ape into them, right? This is
yeah,
this is like the comment, and it's just so it's just so lame, and
yeah,
it's so artless, right? It's like
yeah, exactly,
you're spending all this time with the sculpture. It clearly
yeah,
takes a lot of technical know-how. You're in some fucking like foundry with this metal or whatever it is that you're doing. And
yeah,
on the other end of all this like human effort, you get like a fucking ape, and then you take like 1,000 bananas and you put them there. Which, by the way, I mean, like in terms of like some of the like deeper comments in Galapagos, like I definitely had this thought as I was reading it. Just doing my normal like day-to-day routines, just like watching things outside on my walks, and just thinking like, wow, like human beings just like do so much, and they require so much, and like to what end exactly, you know uh you have a party, and by the end of it, you have like just so much garbage to clean up, right? And it's like could be even like hundreds of pounds of trash, right? Or how much like waste a normal human being typically produces, and how many comforts are not even so much required, but simply by pure, just pure kind of like force of habit, right? You have so many parts in your life that you've become like just completely sensitive to, right? Like you need to always have the temperature. So I say that because I'm that way. I need my temperature a certain way. You need to have like the clothes feel a certain way. I say that because I need my clothes to feel a certain way, right, on my body. Like all these things are just so like they're so self-absorbed, right? They're so the grand scheme of things pointless, and they come about not even like out of necessity, but simply because like you at what point you felt a very nice shirt and you're like, I want to recreate this, or like you were very comfortable in your house during winter, I want to recreate that all the time, right? And all these like needs, right? It's like that. It's like the Vonnegut baby, right, coming into the world screaming for milk, right?
yeah,
And Galapagos definitely gives you that kind of like misanthropy. Not that this is necessarily a misanthropic book, but like um you have to have these like some of these kinds of thoughts as you're reading it.
yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I don't think it ever gets to a point of full misanthropy. It's more so just like general cynicism, like, well, this
Yeah.
is the way we are. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
So
I mean, there's definitely a tension, and I mean, this came up in some like Vonnegut comments in the earlier YouTube videos. Uh, but I mean, there's definitely like a nice tension in Vonnegut between, on the one hand, what seems cynical and perhaps even, just completely hateful, and also just the fact that, I mean, Vonnegut also clearly loves humanity. He loves the fact that a human being can actually, take these like creature comforts and pool these resources that would otherwise like go to waste on like self-indulgence and create a book out of it, right? Do something that is like in some way greater than, right? And that greater than, you could occupy that definition with like, like lots and lots of things, but greater than in general being, greater than just like the sum of like just animal desires, animal machinations, animal behaviors, right? What can you do that is lasting, that is positive, that is like a stepping stone for other people in the future, that will not do anything for you, right? You're doing this like selflessly in some ways.
yeah, the artist that Vonnegut was, I might have even said this in the previous video, but the artist that Vonnegut has always kind of reminded me of the most in terms of his outlook, I guess, would be Ozu, because they both similarly have a love of humanity. They both similarly have a degree of cynicism about like what is actually going to happen in people's lives, like regardless of their like intrinsic worth as people. But where Ozu, I remember in an interview that Dan did one time, I can't remember if it was written or video, it was described that if you notice in a lot of Ozu movies, the camera is always low and pointed slightly up. And so you almost have the impression that you are like a lesser being, like look very slightly looking up at these like, not gods exactly, but these like higher beings. Like Vonnegut sort of is like the other direction. He's looking down slightly, like he boils away some of the perhaps narcissistic particularities that we focus so much on, and he just kind of boils people down to like their simplest and most efficiently and piquantly or trenchantly noticed traits, and he puts them into sort of like wild situations to sort of see what would happen. But in terms of outlook, I think they've always reminded me, like this is more subjective, but I get similar feelings reading a Vonnegut book that I get to watching an Ozu movie. And I think that they come from different times and places, but I think they kind of hit on the same perspective.
Yeah. Do you want to tackle the book's ending? Because I mean, it's interesting in a sense that, it's one of those things where just like the mandarax, like, why it's there, right? Many places it's well done, but it's also like a little bit incomplete, right? And I mean, same thing here, right? So like the ending is this kind of like a thing, right, where essentially there's a bunch of odds and ends, like you mentioned earlier, that every character is touched upon near the end. There is like some sort of resolution, and there is like a kind of like a resolution here, right? But it's kind of like, all right, so everything that the narrator hasn't touched upon, whether it's characters or whether it's like other ideas, we're going to now sort of make sure to hit upon them and give them like some level of closure. And this kind of like, like self-conscious technique, I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but but ultimately, I'm just wondering, like how effective do you think the ending is overall?
Well, I think the last line itself is pretty good.
Yeah.
It does, but it does sort of feel like he didn't quite, like he had a good last line, and he had an ending to the basic story, which is, humanity having perhaps transcended its baser instincts and, return to monkey, as the meme goes. But he couldn't figure out a bridge. So maybe he just kind of took some scraps from like earlier in the novel that he hadn't included or that didn't make sense to include because the narrator doesn't talk about himself as much until near the end of the book. So it's like, I think it's a good ending overall, but the sort of bridge like between the absolute ending and the sort of natural ending of the story feels a little forced in context to me.
Yeah. So like, the ending is where Leon is basically just kind of giving at the very end his origin story, essentially, right? How did he ultimately come to Sweden, right? So like a doctor picks him up, right? He was in Vietnam. He decides to like escape, partly because it seems like he's seen murders, right? He's seen things that he doesn't want to be involved in, right? So he goes AWOL. He also doesn't want to get in trouble, so he essentially ends up like seeking asylum in Sweden. The doctor made me cry so much that I had to be sedated. When I woke up in a cot in his office an hour later, he was watching me. We were all alone. Feel better now, he said. No, I said. Or maybe. It's hard to tell. I've been thinking about your case while you slept, he said. There is one very strong medicine I could prescribe, but I leave it up to you whether or not you want to try it. You should be fully aware of its side effects. I thought he was talking about how resistant syphilis organisms had become to antibiotics, thanks to the law of natural selection. My big brain was wrong again. He said he had friends who could arrange to get me from Bangkok to Sweden if I wanted to seek political asylum there. But I can't speak Swedish, I said. You learn, he said. You learn. Right. Yeah. So I mean the last line is good. It's obviously like hitting upon, some of the themes of like, natural selection, right? You learn, you'll adapt. Like that's like one of the reverberations. There's like other things going on as well. But overall, like it's also like a little bit, I said this word before, pat. It's still kind of pat in this situation too. It works. And I think part of the issue is that we know exactly why it works, right? We know exactly how it works. And I think being able to say that is it's kind of like the difference between like a book that may be good or even like excellent versus like something that is really, like stand out great. Like I feel like there needs to be more ambiguity in terms of like knowing why something works and not knowing it, right? Like there needs to be some tension there that isn't as present in this ending as like other Vonnegut endings might have. Like, I mean, Cat's Cradle is the obvious one, right? There's a very kind of clear reason for it, but there's like 100 sub reasons and different ways you could like tease that out that aren't as apparent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a little, there's nothing specifically wrong with it. It's again, just like, it's just not as good as stuff that you've done in the past. It's a little, to get away from the Scorsese example, it's a little like, there's not a lot of Wallace Stevens poems that I think you could say are like bad outright, but there's quite a lot where you're like, well, you kind of did this already in other poems of yours that I've read, like this wasn't you breaking new ground. This was just you kind of doing a different version of the same thing, but not quite as good, So yeah, it's a totally like it's a totally good, I would say maybe good, maybe a great last line, but like a good ending in general, but it doesn't quite, especially because it doesn't, I guess it works for maybe it doesn't quite work for the book because it's actually a circular ending technically, because it points back toward the very beginning, which is him going to Sweden and becoming a ghost, like, which in terms of the like in terms of the narrative of like evolution and progress is not the right word, but like advancement, or adaptation or whatever. It's just not quite it's not quite the right ending, even though it's a good ending. There's
Hmm.
just it's like you said earlier, the difference between the right word and almost the right word is lightning and lightning bug.
Yeah.
Like it just doesn't it hits a little different, to use another cliche.
Yeah.
It hits a little different and not quite as good.
Yeah.
And it's weird because I feel like we've been more negative here, and I don't feel negatively toward the book at all. In
Yeah, yeah,
fact,
yeah. I think maybe we should make that clear. I mean, this is at minimum an excellent novel, right?
yes.
Very very well done. But I mean, it is kind of interesting, right? To focus, because I mean, we're probably gonna do some other like Vonnegut type thing, and it's kind of nice to have a little bit of variety here in terms of these appraisals. Because I mean, if you read anything about Galapagos now, or like you read or you listen to some of the podcasts, like there's like a few episodes on this, like different people have done over the years. It's almost kind of like uniformly praising the book. But I honestly didn't expect to have this conversation where we would be focusing a lot on the negatives, right? It's just
Well,
how
it's
it
kind of
came out.
I mean, you almost can't help because I mean, you have talked about two of his best books.
Yeah.
Ones where there's very few flaws, so it's a little hard not to notice that this is not quite as much of a slam dunk.
Hmm.
Like he had to hit the backboard first. It's not
Hmm.
like a total swoosh, nothing but net kind of perfect shot book like some of
Yeah.
his other stuff. And I mean, it makes for some variety uh, in podcast / YouTube video content. But I think it's also, especially if there's anybody that's like younger that watches your stuff or listens to your stuff, that is like newer to the arts or newer to the way that our little group has historically talked about the arts, to take something that is, like you said, minimally excellent, are arguably great even with the flaws, because none of the flaws like sink it completely, they just
Hmm.
are noticeable. um to sort of talk about the ways in which it differs from those other books, positive and negative, and to yeah, and to see how that changes it from kind of, because there's like, it's weird because rereading it, I actually had a I like the book quite a bit. I remember loving it the first
Hmm.
time that I read it, and I wouldn't say I loved it this time, like in the same way that if people who saw the Cat's Cradle video, my appraisal of it went up from what lived in my memory. My appraisal of this one went down a little bit from the last time that I read it,
Hmm.
just because for some reason and maybe it's just because I'm older and you always, yeah, until you hit a certain point, you always become a better reader as you get older. You just
Yeah.
are exposed to more things and you notice more things. So I guess it was, to me, interesting to explore why, but I think we praised it plenty too. I mean,
Yeah.
there's plenty of all this stuff that we read was minimally good and often great writing.
Hmm.
As I said, there's nothing like his characterization, I would say, is, other than the fact that it's not as pared back as it usually is, as good as ever. Like he had pretty much mastered this like 2-line description of a person that captures like the totality of their being,
Hmm.
by this point. So he employs it as well as he does anywhere else. It is often, even if it's not always gut bustingly funny, there are still plenty of funny parts, and it's at least minimally humorous in a way that like modern postmodern literature or postmodern or whatever fucking phase of that we're in now usually is not.
Hmm.
Because it's not trying so hard to be clever like most modern literature is. It's just funny because these are people that are in a kind of over the top situation, and they're kind of intrinsically relatable and funny characters unto themselves. It's got a well chosen, if not always perfectly implemented, like motifs, and the central metaphor of like the big brain as
Hmm.
the cause, which you can split into many different directions, like whether you're talking about neurosis or the relentlessly need to experiment in the absence of wisdom, or anything like it's a central metaphor that you can kind of crack into many different interesting pieces.
Mm-hmm.
that that you can evaluate for yourself. So there's nothing about the book that if we could have talked about this book exactly the same as we talked about the other books that we've talked about, nothing but glowing praise and isn't this great and doesn't this work well and doesn't this bounce off this other thing so good. But
Mm-hmm.
to focus on the ways in which it falls a little bit short of the other stuff that I've read, I think is a useful and instructive exercise.
Yeah, I think so too. I actually don't have too much else to say, and I'm also kind of tired. It's not that late here, 10, but I had a very, very late night last night. Guess when I went to sleep?
Uh, well, your definition of late, my definition of late
Yeah,
are historically
that's the
different.
joke.
But
That's the joke. That's the joke. I went to sleep
yeah,
at 12:30 a.m. I was in a neighborhood party. The cops came twice, and we were supposed to be eating by 7 p.m. So I starved myself the whole fucking day, and I only was able to eat by 10. So for 3 hours at the party, I was very, very hostile. I was very hostile. I was very angry. I really, really wanted to fucking eat. I had to get chips from my house. I had to go back to my house, get chips, bring them back.
yeah.
Um,
I've been doing intermittent fasting, and I've accidentally done an almost 24-hour fast because my window happens around dinner time, because that's when I get home late from work.
yeah.
So it doesn't make sense to start my window earlier than that. So it's been 23 hours since I ate.
Yeah. And now I honestly feel now I feel kind of sickly after everything that I ate yesterday.
Was it
Um,
good at least?
it was very good. It was all Guyanese and Trinidadian food. Um, it was noodles, rice, curries. Today there was a little after party that I went to. Took my cup of dal. It was a very good dal. Some people around my block, they made it. So that was nice. But I had there's these very deleterious cupcakes about half an hour walk from me, and I got 32 of them, because there's always a bunch of people that show up to these parties. So I was like, let me just make sure everybody at least gets a cupcake. But you eat one and it's so overpowering, uh and you always feel so full afterwards. But it was already past midnight, and I have to go to sleep by 11 all the time. It was already past midnight. I was already drunk. I was high, and I was like, fuck it. I'm already crossed so many boundaries. I'm gonna have a second cupcake. And then today they brought out a slice of cake. I had a slice of cake. So I feel very sickly, right? So I hope when I wake up tomorrow, it's going to be, a fresh week for me, where maybe I don't eat for 2.5 days, right? And feel better, right, after.
Nice. Well, I guess you should go get some shut eye puppy. It sounds like you had a really rough day.
Yeah, but now I turned down my flux here, so it's all been blue light, and we've been talking, so now I'm amped up, and I'm supposed to be going to sleep soon, but I know I'm going to be not going to sleep now because of this conversation, right? Whenever it gets too late, I'm always tossing and turning and thinking about what was said, right?
Yeah.
So
well, I'm also I got to work tomorrow, and I'm sure I won't be able to go to bed for at least 2 hours, and then I have done no laundry when I'm supposed to, so I'm going to have to borrow a pair of scrubs at work tomorrow, which I hate doing and which they make annoying. So I hope that's a painless process.
well, speaking of which, I didn't even shower today. That's how fucked up I've been. Didn't even shower today, so now
Are you an everyday showerer?
Twice a day usually.
Really?
I just sweat too much, and my hair always traps sweat, right? So I'm always trimming my body hairs. I'm a very high maintenance guy. I have not met many males as high maintenance as I am. I have so many. I remember when I was visiting Dan. This was either in 2011 or 2013, and we were getting ready to go on a hike. And I was like, I took a shower and I was like, I was like shaving in the bathroom and I was like doing my fucking ponytail. And he was like, Alex, we're just going on a hike. You're not gonna go get laid.
Yeah, that's
All right. So thank you guys for watching. This has been ArtiFact number 21. Also available on YouTube if you're going from the audio podcast. Available on audio if you're listening to this on YouTube. Maybe next time Keith and I have something that we record together, it's going to be in person, right? So you could see like the bodily differential between us. So anyway, thank you guys for watching, and we will see you soon.
Oh my God.